Historically given a bad name, wrongly labelled as light and floral in style, it's time to update our knowledge in the Lowland region. It's very much a geographical place rather than a flavour, so grab a dram, I'll take you there. Let's dive in. Hello, Hendo here, and welcome to Scotch Whisky, a Lowland Region deep dive. In this video, I'll share my insights to probably the most unappreciated of Scotch whisky region. Light and floral, triple distilled. Think again. Alfred Barnard visited 23 Lowland distilleries in 1887. 7 were column distilling. There's little mention of triple distilling, and most used peat to fire their kilns. Anais MacDonald's 1930 whisky book notes 7 Lowland distilleries. Subdividing the Lowland region can be done in a few different ways, but I'll stick to these topics. Geology, then and now, politics, Fife, Edinburgh, Glasgow and South Scotland. First up is geology and geography. There's stark contrast in the land south of the Highland boundary fault. Water flows over the fault, Dalradian rock and old red sandstone in the deep rift Midland Valley, shaped by the last ice age, receded north of Loch Lomond 11,000 years ago. Agriculture, pastures, fertile brown soils, sedimentary coalfields, rising southern uplands where the continents collided, Scotland and England. Edinburgh Castle sits on a volcanic plug, and the ancient forests made way for barley growing a few thousand years ago in the Lothians. The Lowland region is a diagonal line from the Firth of Clyde in the west to the Firth of Tay in the east for its northern frontier to the Highlands, and then the south is the English border, and it's going to cover the central belt and south of Scotland, which includes the Kingdom of Fife, Edinburgh, the Lothians, Glasgow, Clyde Valley, Ayrshire, Dumfries and Galloway and the Scottish borders. Distilleries are well spread out in the Lowlands with different microclimates. To then and now, from first written record at Lindores Abbey, Fife, 1494, farm distillers, greengrocers to industrialists and whisky barons, huge social changes in Highland clearances jarred with developing lowlands. Less talked about the lowland clearances, agricultural revolution from 17th to 19th century, age of improvement, lowland farmers and cotters moved to cities or left Scotland entirely. Almost everyone in Scotland became landless. The commercial age of linen factories, tobacco, banking, the steam age, shipbuilding, industrialization, child labour and slums. Edinburgh became the epicentre of Enlightenment era science, medicine, university writers, historians and philosophy. In 1827, Scotsman Robert Stein invented the continuous still. Then Irishman Aeneas Coffey invented the Coffey or patent still in 1830. Coffey's patent still was bigger, more complex and more efficient than Stein's. At the time, Irish whisky dominated world markets, even in Scotland, but Irish distillers didn't buy into it, sticking to their pot stills. Coffey supplied lowland Scotland. Grange Distillery in Alloa was the first to install, but didn't last. The high initial cost and whisky lacking in character and flavour was a big risk. Scotland was soon flooded by cheap whisky. In 1853, Andrew Usher in Edinburgh pioneered blended whisky. Greengrocers who had blended tea and rum switched to blending whisky. The Lowlands became the engine room for Scotch whisky exports. Spirit from all regions came to be blended, bottled and shipped. In the cycles that would follow, boom or bust, the Lowlands drove Scotch whisky forward with ruthless efficiency, city whisky barons determining the fate of faraway distilleries. Exports rose and fell during the wars and a 1980s slump. Now there's a 21st century craft distilling boom. Some distilled gin first and now are malting the whisky. It's seen as Lowland resurgence, and as of 2019 there were 18 distilleries in the region, which will likely rise. Now to politics. The 1644 Excise Act levied tax on whisky enforced by excise officers known as gaugers, as their job was to gauge the quantity and value of spirits produced. Famous poet Rabbie Burns in Ayrshire became an exciseman in 1788, conflicting his love for Scotch whisky. The 1784 Wash Act, Highland distilleries were taxed based upon the size of their still. Lowland distilleries were taxed per gallon in the wash. There was no incentive to age the spirit. The term lowland is a protected locality for Scotch whisky distilling under UK government legislation in 2009. Despite the strength of Glasgow and Edinburgh, they were powerless to boardroom decisions, 1920s mergers, closures and international acquisitions. London corporates created Diageo in 1997, where James Buchanan had grown his empire. Let's start in the Kingdom of Fife. 18th and 19th century, the Steen and Hague family were whisky dynasties and industrialists of their time. Andrew Steen first established Kennet Pan's distillery in 1720, surviving to 1825. By 1733, Kennet Pan's was the largest distillery in Scotland, run by his son. His son then founded Jameson's Bow Street Distillery in Dublin, 1780. Nearby Kilbaggy Distillery operated from 1777 to 1851, the largest distillery in Scotland in 1777. Both distilleries had huge resources and could dominate their position. The grain whisky produced was coarse. Burns describes Kilbaggy's whisky as the most rascally liquor. The spirit was rectified into gin, specifically for the London market, but this collapsed after 1786 Distillers Act tax hikes. Kilbaggy had been the first Scottish distillery to export spirit, and the continuous still was invented by Robert Steen in 1826. John Hague, his cousin, founded John Hague & Co. at Cameron Bridge. Now Diageo owned the largest grain distillery in Europe, with Cameron Brig and Hague Club single grain whisky brands. Diageo has a distillery and bottling plant in Leven since 1973, an experimental facility, one of the only licensed distilleries in Scotland without a spirit safe. Today, Linda's Abbey Distillery has been resurrected by the Mackenzie Smith family, distilling since 2017, releasing their first single malt this July. Daft Mill near Cooper by Francis Cuthbert since 2005 grow their own barley at Daft Mill Farm and release highly sought after yearly vintages. I actually forgot to mention them in my video is their terroir and whisky. Then there's Eden Mill, based at Guardbridge with St Andrews University, hoping to have their new visitor centre open next spring and working towards a carbon neutral facility by 2024. Kingsbarn Distillery opened in 2014 by the Weems family. Dream to Dram is a whisky with barley grown in East Fife, aged in Heaven Hill casks, and launched Balcombe whisky named after the castle. Inchdairney Distillery since 2014 in Glenrothes, and they supply whisky for the blending market, but distills first Scotch oat whisky and hopes to release a rye whisky soon called Rylaw and a single malt by 2029. Both Weems and Inchdairney have plans for maturation sites near Glenrothes. And then there's Lady of the Glen, independent bottler, is based in Dalgety Bay. Now to Edinburgh and its surrounds. In 1505, the Guild of Barbers and Surgeons were granted a monopoly for distilling aquavitae in Edinburgh by James IV of Scotland. In 1777, there were at least 8 licensed stills in Edinburgh, but almost 1,000 illegally. Leith, a shipping port, storage hub and bottle production facility, had Old Alliance links to Bordeaux negotiating families since 12th century. By the 16th century, 100 bonded warehouses storing wine, whisky and brandy. Leith became part of Edinburgh in 1920. Crabby's traces its roots back to Edinburgh in 1801, making ginger wine with whisky. Crabby's, now owned by Halewood Spirits, opened Bonington Distillery in Leith 2018, filling their first casks last year. Ballantyne's whisky goes back to 1827. 19-year-old George Ballantyne opened a greengrocer in the Cowgate, moved to a bigger store on South Bridge, was aging whiskies by 1836, and by 1857 offered free delivery within 10 miles. Exports blended whisky worldwide by 1881. White Horse blended whisky was named after a coaching inn on Edinburgh's Canongate. The Usher brothers bought Glensheen's distillery in 1859, called it Edinburgh Distillery, closed in 1925. Independents Andrew Usher, William Sanderson and John Crabby co-founded North British Grain Distillery in Gorgie, Edinburgh in 1880, now a joint venture between Diageo and Edrington Group, and provides Edinburgh with this daily roasted malt aroma. Edinburgh's other grain distillery, the Caledonian, was built in Haymarket 1855, closed in 1988. In the 1890s, blended Scotch whisky was riding high until the Pattison brothers crash. This is a family business, started out as Edinburgh dairy wholesalers. They thrived during the whisky boom era, but they're spending high in advertising, palatial offices in Leith. But their extravagance and overvalued property came crashing down in 1898. A downturn, whisky prices fell and hit the entire Scotch whisky industry. B&J, Bailey Nicol Jarvie, blended Scotch by Glenmorangie, once owned by Edinburgh wine and spirits merchant MacDonald and Muir, was my gateway whisky. Glenmorangie has facilities in West Lothian. Newtown Garishta Compass Box Whisky was founded in 2000 by American entrepreneur John Glazier, shaking up Scotch whisky with their aging techniques. Holyrood Distillery opened in 2019. Port of Leith Distillery, Scotland's first vertical distillery, due to open 2022. Edinburgh Whisky are blenders and bottlers. On Princes Street, you have the new Johnny Walker Experience is about to open up, and the Scotch Whisky Experience on the Royal Mile has the largest private collection of Scotch whisky. The Scotch Malt Whisky Society, founded in 1983 as a private club, sell single cask bottlings and run bars like the Vaults in Leith and Queen Street. Scotch Whisky Association, the trade body representing Scotch whisky as an industry, is based in Edinburgh, was founded in 1942. About 15 miles east of Edinburgh, Glenkinchie Distillery, founded 1825 as Milton Distillery, has recently refurbed and reopened a visitor centre, promoted four corners of Scotland distilleries of Johnny Walker, Diageo owned. Broxburn in West Lothian near Edinburgh is headquarters of Ian MacLeod Distillers, who owns Glengoyne, Tamdhu, Sheep Dip Blended Malt, MacLeod's, Chieftains, As We Get It, Pig's Nosed, Lang's and various other blended Scotch whisky brands. St Magdalen Distillery in Linlithgow between Union Canal and railway line used peat and coke to fire kilns, built by Sebastian Henderson 1753, was culled along with many other icons in 1983. Rosebank Distillery, Falkirk, one of my favourites, was founded in 1840. Memorable Diageo's Flora and Fauna series was mothballed, but now owned by Ian MacLeod Distillers, who hope to reopen it next year. They also own Glengoyne Distillery, operating since 1833, 12 miles north of Glasgow. Inverhouse Distillers has blending and warehousing in Airdrie, Lanarkshire. Burns Stewart Distillers, now owned by Distill, has blending, bottling and warehousing in East Kilbride. Now to Glasgow, my hometown, and famous for blenders, brands, maturing stock, bonded warehouses and new distillers. The 1725 malt tax rise has been immortalised in a modern expression by Glasgow Distillery in Hillington. They've been open since 2014. The original distillery of that name opened 1770 to 1902, so they named their first single malt 1770 and are releasing a triple distilled whisky. Clydeside Distillery was founded in 2017 by Tim Morrison, as owner of Ayrshire's AD Rattery. Beam Suntory has a bonded site in Springburn. Strathclyde Distillery by Shivers in the Gorbals, overlooking Glasgow Green, where James Watt was inspired to create the steam engine 2 centuries before. The plant goes back to 1927. Like many grain distilleries, had a malt distillery within it. Here, Kinclaith Distillery, running from 1957 to 1975, mainly supplied blends. Today, Strathclyde distills mainly wheat, which provides proving bread aromas in the park. Port Dundas Distillery, next to the Forth and Clyde Canal, built in 1811, at its peak was the largest distillery in Scotland. Produced grain whisky used in Johnnie Walker, J&B, Bell's, Black and White, VAT 69, Hague and White Horse blended whisky brands, owned by Diageo, producing 39 million litres of spirit each year until closure in 2010. Some long-aged single grain Port Dundas still available from independent bottlers. Shield Hall Diageo, the world's largest packing site, 27 million cases of Scotch whisky each year for Johnnie Walker, J&B, Buchanan's, Bell's, White Horse and Black and White. Glasgow is headquarters for brands like White Mackay, founded in 1844, Teachers, Highland Cream, now owned by Beam Suntory, which traces roots to Glasgow 1830s grocery shop, moved to offices in St Enoch Square in 1875. Edinburgh moved their head office from Perth to central Glasgow 2016. Shivers Brothers just opened a new head office, and Remy Cointreau have their office nearby as well. Douglas Leng bottlers trace their history back to 1948, own Strathern Distillery, opening new Clutha Distillery, and release single cask bottlings and blended malts. Brothers Fred and Stuart Leng split the business in 2013. Stuart and Sons own Hunter Leng with cask bottlings brands and Ardnahoe Distillery on Islay. West of Scotland is Auchentoshan Distillery, founded 1823 in Clydebank, meaning corner of the field. Triple distills. Three Wood is a popular expression. Was Morrison Bowmore, became Beam Suntory in 2014. 3 miles west from there was Little Mill Distillery at Bowling on the north side of the Firth of Clyde. Claims to be Scotland's first and oldest licensed whisky distillery, 1772. Last distilled in 1994. Remaining stock sold by Loch Lomond Distillers. Loch Lomond Distillery since 1814, with master blender Michael Henry at the helm. Shivers bottles in Dumbarton, having moved from Paisley. There was the name Allied Dominic, merged into Pernod Ricard. Inverleven Distillery in Dumbarton, now closed, distilled single malt for Shivers Brothers. Ballantyne's whisky, with their famous geese protecting the warehouses. Strathleven Distillers makes quintuple single malt. Moving to South Scotland, starting in Ayrshire, Robert Burns lived during illicit whisky boom time. The smugglers' coast near Troon, where ships from Ireland and Kintyre would supply villages. In 1820, 200 years ago, John Walker, a farmer's son, started a grocer's shop in Kilmarnock. His father had died the year before and was set up with the proceeds of the farm, Johnny Walker brand with iconic Striding Man red and black label, closed the Kilmarnock plant in 2009. The Glasgow and Ayr Railway 1840 for transporting coal brought Ayrshire into the industrial age. Ayrshire has a rich whisky making heritage, but some remains in Girvan, South Ayrshire. Ailsa Bay by William Grants, built in 1963, produces single grain whisky. Ladyburn Distillery was an expansion of the Girvan Distillery, created in 1966 but closed in 1975. Argowan Distillery near Inverkip is due to open next year. There was a distillery of that name in Greenock in 1896. Catrin is a bonded warehouse for Loch Lomond distillers. Loch Lee Farm near Talbolton, where Robert Burns lived, is due to release whisky by the end of this year. A.D. Rattray Bottle in Kirkoswald, founded 2002, named after an ancestor of owner Tim Morrison going back to 1868, greengrocer in Partick, Glasgow. Morrison is the son of Stanley Morrison, a famous Glasgow whisky broker. South of Ayrshire, Dumfries and Galloway Bladnoch Distillery was established 1817. Also had Flora and Fauna series, now revived in 2015 by David Pryor. The first Australian to buy a Scotch whisky distillery. They've just launched Vinia single malt Scotch whisky. Annandale Distillery in Annan, Dumfries and Galloway was first established in 1836 by George Donald, later bought by Johnny Walker in 1893 and closed in 1924. Production restarted in 2014 after 7-year rebuild, used peat and unpeated malt and looking to rewrite the Lowlands story. In the Scottish Borders, you have Borders Distillery in Hawick, opened in 2018, the first Scotch whisky distillery in the Scottish Borders since 1837. Lower East Side blended malt brand and Clan Fraser blended whisky. The Tweeddale blended whisky in Coldstream by the River Tweed was originally 1895 until 1940s. There's the owner's R&B distillery. Highland Queen blended Scotch based in Kelso in the Borders. Jackson Distillers have just announced they will open a big facility, St Boswell Distillery in the Scottish Borders, to make grain whisky. You also have Simpson's Malting since 1963, supplies many distillers with malted barley across Scotland, based in Berwick-upon-Tweed. Do tell us if I missed any, what you think of Lowland Region Scotch whisky. Put your favourites in the comments. Watch the other videos in the series, and if you're interested in projects, contact us at hendotalks.com. As always, welcome your feedback. I hope this was useful to you in some way, and until next time, thanks very much for watching.